Welcome everybody to our webinar. Our webinar today is on clinical outcome assessments, build new or adapt old. My name is Elizabeth Earline and I'm Senior Director of Research and Programs at the NHC, and I'm excited to get started with this webinar featuring Stacey Hudgens, the CEO at Clinical Outcome Solutions. Before I turn it over to Stacie, I wanted to just go over a few quick housekeeping items. First and perhaps foremost, everybody's been muted on entry, so please make sure that you don't unmute yourself during the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please go ahead and type them into the chat function. We'll be sure to allow plenty of time at the end of the call for Stacie to take any questions. If you look at the WebEx screen, the chat function is the little bubble at the bottom. So please just type that in and we will take those questions. Next slide, please. As many of you know and who have participated throughout the series, we began this monthly series last November to ensure that the NHC membership, especially our patient members, are prepared to engage in conversations about clinical outcome assessment. And we know that with FDA's guidance series on patient-focused drug development, that there's a tremendous amount of interest and excitement about working with patients and increasing patient centricity of clinical outcome assessments, especially patient-reported outcomes. So next month will be our 1-year anniversary of start, and all of our webinars are available on the NHC website. Next slide, please. So the objective for today's webinar will be to go over and introduce clinical outcome assessments, which are an important aspect of patient-focused development and care, and reflect on developing new COAs and how they can be very expensive and resource-consuming task for patient groups and other partners. Patient groups might consider adapting existing COAs instead and tailoring them to their disease or condition. So Stacie will introduce when that might be appropriate and when one might want to start new. And this webinar will present important considerations for either developing a new COA or adapting an existing COA. Next slide, please. So I would like to turn it over to Stacey Hudgens. Stacie is the CEO and founder, as well as the strategic lead of quantitative at Clinical Outcome Solutions, which is a global health economics and outcomes research strategic consulting firm. Stacie has over 23 years of research experience, specializing in research design and statistical and psychometric analysis. She also holds an adjunct position at the University of Arizona in the College of Pharmacy, as well as an adjunct position at the University of Illinois College of Medicine at Peoria. So Stacie, with that, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that really kind introduction, which is also dating myself. My background is in patient outcomes, and I started off in academia working on the functional assessment of cancer therapy measurement system with Dr. Dave Sella, and have been working quite extensively in the area of oncology, but I also work quite extensively in dermatology, gastroenterology, and immunology. So most of my work over the course of my career has not only been on the quantitative side of patient outcomes, but it's really been elevating patient outcomes to the forefront of new drug development. And my passion recently, due to a diagnosis of metastatic cancer with one of my parents, I've also moved into more of the caregiver arena, which is really changing my career from the quantitative perspective to really bringing me back to the core of my interest, which is patient involvement in clinical research. So I'm really honored that I was asked to give this presentation, and I'm hoping that I can provide you all with information that you need that can really help you plan out how to get to an outcome that that meets the needs of your patients. Next slide. So health outcomes research has evolved over the years with 21st century cures and the patient drug development process. The regulatory arena has really kind of stepped up in terms of really moving the patient's voice to the forefront of clinical research. But we definitely still have a really long way to go to really consider the patient's voice in terms of how one feels and functions. And I say that because we have quite a few legacy tools that are in the public domain. And we're looking toward areas of how do we standardize these. But one of the things that I've found in recent years is that while we think of it from a clinical trial perspective, often in the health outcomes research arena, we also have to think about it in terms of the real world and what patients are actually touched by these outcomes. And so individual patient goals vary. And especially in, say, terminal conditions or chronic long-term conditions, a patient's goal can also change over the course of their illness. And so it should be recognized in terms of clinical studies. And then the question becomes, how well do the measures that exist actually truly address patient concerns? So when we think of health outcomes from that perspective, we think of it in terms of disease-related symptoms. So I'm going to kind of hold on to a few examples. So if I look, for example, in dermatology, and I'll select psoriasis. I've done quite a bit of work in psoriasis. When we look at psoriasis, there's a lot of the symptoms of disease are uncomfortable for patients. They have a lot of, you have itching, you have redness, but then the impact as you get more severe and a patient's go from, say, early mild psoriasis symptoms, and they get into psoriatic disease like psoriatic arthritis, we start to see detriment in terms of their functional status and what that means to patients in terms of how it impacts their daily living. I'm sorry, there's an echo, I think, there, Elizabeth. So in terms of their functional status, their ability to do things that they would normally do, to go to work, which then impacts, say, their quality of life. And then, of course, we have, which is quite important to regulators, but also to patients, of course, is treatment tolerability. One of the things that we know about psoriasis treatments is that we have biologics, which are often injectables, right? And some of the tolerability issues, but then also the patient's perception of the treatment, right? A lot of patients, and I'm sure those of you who are psoriasis patient advocates on the line know, is that there's a large number of severe patients who are untreated because they don't want to go the biologic direction, and so they're still using topicals when they should have moved on to something that would be a bit more effective. And so we've done a lot of real world research on what outcomes are important to patients in terms of disease-related symptoms, functional status, quality of life, and treatment tolerability, and really asking the patients directly about how they feel. Next slide. So just to bring it back, and I know that you've probably participated in other presentations on this, but there's 4 types of COAs that we really consider. And the way that you can think about this is where are we getting the information from? So there's patient-reported outcomes, which are reported directly from the patient and might include, say, the SF-36, a patient symptom diary, like the brief pain inventory. We all go to the doctor and we see the 0 to 10 scale. I know when my mom was sick, everyone kept saying, "What is your pain?" 0 to 10, 0 to 10. Or they would point at a smiley face algorithm. So that's directly from the patient without input from anyone else. A clinician-reported outcome, or as we like to use a lot of acronyms, the ClinRO, is reported directly from a trained healthcare professional. And so in this, we might ask a clinician's global impression of patient severity, say in an indication. The one thing that's really important to note here is who is the data coming from and who's the best, most reliable source. Obviously, the patient is our ideal source of information about how they feel or function, particularly when it's unobservable, like fatigue or pain or, say, nausea. You can get that information from someone else, but generally, when it is an attribute that's not visible, we generally want to get that from the patient. Now, most of the outcomes that are used in clinical trials historically have been clinician-reported outcomes. Observer-reported outcomes are observations from a person other than the patient or the healthcare professional. Generally, this is a caregiver, such as a spouse, a family member, and in a previous ADHD study, it came from teachers. So these are folks who have spent a considerable amount of time with the patient and can report on patients' functional status, for example, or observable symptoms. In pediatric studies, there's quite a few guidances around when can the patient reliably report for themselves and when do we need to use a parent or another caregiver. Finally, in quite a new area, even for us in outcomes research, are performance outcomes. And in these, you have like the 6-minute walk test, for example. And this is when a task is performed by a patient per a healthcare professional's instructions. So you often see this in cognitive testing, where a test is administered and then the patient performs an activity. This is an area where we're seeing a lot for those of you who are working in areas where you're seeing like Fitbits being used. This is an area that we're really starting to get into in outcomes research, is how can we use actual physical performance data in making decisions about how a patient functions. Next slide. So today we're actually going to be talking more about patient-reported outcomes, and these are a few direct quotes. So a PRO is based on a report that comes from the patient, as I indicated, and the status of a patient's health condition without amendment or interpretation of the patient's report by a clinician or anyone else. So to come back to this particular presentation, what we're doing when we're looking at tools that are already existing and are out in the field is who is the source of the data and were patients involved in the development of that PRO. And as I indicated, symptoms or other unobservable concepts known only to the patients can really only be measured by PROs. This is really important because as you're looking through the literature and identifying what we would consider legacy or historic outcomes, you want to make sure that, one, the patient was involved in the development process, and that if the patient wasn't involved in the development process, they were at least able to review the tool prior to its use in a clinical study. Many of the legacy PROs that are out in the field have been developed by doctors or specialists in an area, and patients may not have been involved. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. Next slide. So interpreting clinical outcomes, I really, really like this cartoon. I'm not one to, I think if we go back to the fact that I'm a quantitative scientist, it's rare that I use cartoons, but I really like this one. For being able to interpret clinical outcomes, one of the things that I've found, and especially shifting from researcher to caregiver, is that giving a patient a clinical number, say a 70 milliliter improvement in FEV1, so lung function, what does that really mean to the patient? When my mom was in the hospital, when she went from 55 liters per minute at 100% of oxygen to 2.5 milliliters or liters per minute at 100%, that didn't, what it meant to her was not, oh, you have, a 52 and a half liter per minute improvement. What it meant to her was, I don't have to have oxygen blowing so aggressively into my nose, right? So it's really extras. This is really great because when you're talking to a patient, is what does that mean to their life? What can they do? So in this particular case, you see this man on the bicycle, his exercise test in the hospital, where he's giving it his all because the healthcare professional is watching, but then the day-to-day activity at home is, whew, I'm really worn out. And I think we have to be very cognizant when we're interacting with patients to make sure that we ask patients, what is a meaningful interpretation of improvement for you? And so as you're reviewing these legacy tools, please go back to the first slide that I presented, which was, what are the patient's goals? And do the items on these existing tools actually map to what's important to patients? And not only from a content perspective, but are patients able to describe what a meaningful change would be on the individual items and on the scale that you're measuring? So what does it mean to have a later improvement in lung function in terms of symptom improvement and functioning? And how can we communicate that best to patients? Next slide. So there's the FDA roadmap, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because what I really want to focus on is that from understanding the disease or condition, there's quite a bit of information that's in the literature in terms of, say, the natural history of disease or the condition. But there's also, you have to get into patient subpopulations and the particular healthcare environment in which a patient is exposed. So the one thing I do want to call your attention to, and I think this is very important, and I just brought this up at the longevity meeting, is that the patient's perspective and different subpopulations and how these outcomes are communicated to patients. In the literature, there are quite a bit of scientific manuscripts. Those scientific manuscripts are not really written in patient friendly or even day-to-day folks language. And so it's really important to try and pull material on the patient and caregiver perspectives to the degree that it's available. If it's absolutely not available, what's really critical to do is to go and talk to patients. I think it's really critical to talk to patients and caregivers about how they're feeling, how they're functioning, any symptoms. And once you're able to do that, then identifying the concept of interest that is meaningful to the patients. And so this roadmap means a bit more to me than it did a few months ago, where actually in this first column in understanding the disease or condition, really understanding the patient perspective or the caregiver perspective. Now, in terms of the roadmap, as you as individual patient groups kind of mitigate the regulatory pathway on identifying these outcomes, it's really understanding the patient perspective, identifying what's important in terms of symptomatic benefit or functional benefit, or in terms of tolerability, and then identifying what type of clinical outcome assessment is the best that you would use to measure that. For example, is the best data source the patient? Is it the caregiver, or is it the clinician? So you really want to identify who's going to give you the most reliable information. And what's very important to note, and I did see that we have some members from the Lupus Foundation, is that it is often the case that you need the clinician reported outcomes, right, in terms of severity, as well as the patient's perspective, and in some indications also the caregiver perspective. So you want to make sure that you, as you look at these tools that are available, you think, well, can I use an existing tool, or do I need to build a new one? Is what type of COA do I need? And then you can start with your selecting, and you can kind of get down into the searching for existing tools. And then if you need to, begin COA development. The B and C here is a bit cloudy in this roadmap, because you may not need to begin or build a new tool. It may be that you can use a legacy tool, or you can modify a legacy tool rather than develop new. Next slide. So here's an example of direct evidence of treatment benefit in asthma. I really like this conceptual flow, which shows and you can't see beneath these bubbles, but we have the proximal concepts and distal concepts. From a regulatory focus, what we call disease-defining concepts are more direct symptoms of disease. And in this particular case, in asthma, you have these are critical symptoms: coughing, wheezing, difficulty breathing, chest tightness, inflammation, exacerbation. And then as you get more to the proximal impacts, you're looking at kind of impact on function, right? You have discomfort, exercise limitation. What's not included here, which is all the way at the more distal concepts, are what are the impacts that it has on school, work, independence. So from a regulatory perspective, we're really interested in evidence of treatment benefit. But when you think about what's important to patients, it's this entire bundle. So all the way from improving symptoms to more distal impacts on their general quality of life. So these are very important to measure. As you can see, we say a more payer focus, because what's more from the payer side, or the reimbursement side of this, we're looking at, can a patient return to if a patient's goals might be to return to their normal function, return to school, return to work, be able to be independent and have stronger role functioning. And so understanding that the proximal and the distal benefit of treatment for patients might be, I want all of this. Whereas to get to regulatory approval, you may need the more proximal concepts, but knowing that you do need to cover everything. Next slide. I do one more thing. I think if we could go back, sorry. I do want to say here that moving away from just a purely clinical trial perspective, in real world studies, we find, and we conduct a lot of them. I did a really a recent study in metastatic pancreatic disease, and what we found from patients is that really these last two columns here, which we, from a regulatory perspective, would consider them distal, but from a patient perspective, these are very proximal to their disease. So I do want to say that there's the clinical trial perspective, the regulatory perspective, but when you're talking to a patient, you really have to understand that what might be considered distal to regulators is actually quite proximal to the patient, and we have to make sure that we ensure that their voice is heard in the real world setting as well. Next slide. Now I'm able. Can you just click through so that I think they all come up? There we go. So defining a patient-reported outcome strategy, build new or adapt old. So as part of the PRO selection process, in some indications that you're working on, there are going to be 10, 15, 20 tools that are on the market. And when you look at them, they all appear to measure the same thing, but a bit differently, right? Some are frequency, so how often can you do this activity, versus severity, how impaired are you in terms of being able to do this activity? So measures are then evaluated to determine whether they meet a patient's expectation for assessing symptoms, function, treatment tolerability, and quality of life. If the tool exists, right, and it measures the context of use, it measures concept of interest. So if I go back to my original example of psoriasis symptoms, right, let's say skin symptoms, which measure do I use? There's 5 or 6 measures, right, that I personally know of that have been used by different groups to measure psoriasis symptoms. So which measures? We review the existing and then we conduct what we call a gap analysis. And the gap analysis says, well, and I'll get into this in a moment more in detail, but it basically says, were patients included in the development? Yes or no? Is there psychometric evidence, which is basically statistical methods to look at the reliability and validity of the tool. Like that from a content perspective, it might match, but it may not perform well, let's say in a real world or a clinical trial. So we look at it and we say, okay, well, does it exist? All the items match patient feedback and it fits to what we need in terms of evidence, or it closely aligns, but we need a bit of editing. Where we might see this is in terms of a scale that is how difficult is it for you to go to work every day? For example, this is one that I worked on recently. And the scale was on a 0 to 10 scale, a numeric rating scale. Well, that's quite difficult to interpret, right? Because you're saying how difficult is it? You could say 0 to 10, but you could modify that and put it on a not difficult at all to very difficult with moderately and somewhat difficult as some of the anchors. Those are modifications that will require a bit of psychometric work, but may not require you to go back to the patient group. Or you need to develop a new tool. The older tool does not fit the current feedback from patients, and so you really need to start from scratch and develop a new tool. I will say this, that in previous research, you saw quite a bit of new tool development. What we're seeing now is the introduction of item banks and revitalizing, I would say, legacy tools, or doing a bit more on debriefing or going back to patients with a number of tools and saying which one fits the best. So we're seeing a lot more of bringing legacy tools forward so that we don't have to spend a lot of time developing new tools. Where we see a lot of new tool development is in rare and orphan indications where we're still learning about what's important to patients. Next slide. Here we go. Here we go. So this is a nice little, what do we call this? The traffic light. There we go. As you can see here, PRO processes and timing, really this is more from registration labeling. But when you think about it, if you're developing a tool for clinical practice as well, for the PRO strategy, you always want to do a literature review and get subject matter expert input and get feedback, if you will. from patients. So it's really case dependent on if you need to do interviews with patients on existing tools or if you're modifying a tool. So I'm not going to focus too much on the psychometric validation, but as you do a gap analysis, what you're really looking for is the content validity. Have patients been involved? And for an existing tool, you rarely need to do any, let's say, focus group or patient interviews because unless they were not involved, and then you will have to do it. But as you can see here, this offers a kind of a timeline on how long it takes. Really, where you want to spend a lot of your time with a lot of the legacy tools is spending a lot of time on the literature review and getting subject matter expert input. If it's a tool that's been widely used, this is going to go quite quickly. If it's a tool that might be brand new and has quite a bit of information, it's very likely that the developer did follow some of the recent FDA guidance. So it's just being very careful in addressing each of these measurement topics and saying, well, what do I really need to do? And I think as we get closer to the last two columns here, ePro is electronic data collection, which is kind of a newer way in which we're collecting patient outcomes data in clinical trials. However, historically they've been paper pencil, but you're often seeing that it's case dependent because a lot of the newer tools or even legacy tools are being adapted into an electronic format. But it can go either way. There's a lot of information on whether or not it should be paper pencil or electronic. A lot of patients are preferring electronic data collection, obviously for ease of use. They can do it on a smartphone or they can do it on their computer. So it's really understanding the patient population. For this particular one, as you're deciding, do you need to build a new tool or how do you evaluate existing tools? What I would say for those of you who are doing this is to look at these first three broader areas. So the PRO strategy, content validity, and is there data to show the reliability and validity from a more statistical perspective? Next slide. So in summary, build new or adapt old. Start with what's most important to patients and caregivers. And I would add on to this that identify whether or not the tool should be measured by the patient. So should it be a PRO? Should it be a clinician reported outcome? Or should it be an observer reported outcome? I think, or is it a combination? And if it's a combination, then looking at what is available in the field is really going to help drive it. But if you do realize that you need all three, the most important will be to get that information from patients. Next, are there existing tools which fit your needs? And the one thing that is really most important is what if there's a multitude of tools that fit your needs, right? If there's a multitude of tools that fit your needs, then conduct that gap analysis. Go back and say, have there been focus groups? Have there been interviews? What is the reliability and validity of the tool? How has it been used? Has it been used in clinical trials? Has it been used in real world observational studies? Is it used in clinical practice? Because quite often we're going to be working with tools that may have been developed for clinical practice or as a screening tool, but then we want to use it in a clinical trial or in a longitudinal, say, observational study. So are there existing tools that fit your needs, and are there any issues with the tool? And then, is what you find patient-centered? Is the quality good enough? And this is an area where I challenge my colleagues in the outcomes research arena, having worked in PROs for 20 plus years. And I'll be very honest, I thought I knew functional status. I I was confident in the work that we were doing. And then when I started caregiving for my mom, I realized that some of the questions to measure physical function were always going to be no, right? Um, that a lot of the static tools that are on the market don't address the full patient severity continuum. And what you want to think about is what you find patient-centered, and not only patient-centered for the general population, but from the most mild patients, which are or the most able patients, to the most severe patients with an indication. And so what I'm relearning as an outcomes researcher is what is patient-centered and who are the patients, who are the populations. So I would challenge, as you review the literature and identify some of the legacy tools, is it might be fit for some, but not fit for all. And is the quality good enough, or do I need to adapt it to make it fit for all patients in my population? And then use what you've learned to make the decision. So you feel comfortable with this legacy tool. How can you use it? And do you feel comfortable moving it forward? Next slide. Questions?
Great. Thank you so much, Stacie. I have a couple of questions that came in, and then one that I wanted to kick it off with as well is you mentioned a couple of times about patient groups should take a look to see what tools exist. And I was wondering if you could provide some suggestions about the best places to start, maybe some search terms or something like that, or other places. And then also, once you identify some existing tools, how do you find out whether or not patients were involved?
So in terms of search terms, I actually we have some terms that we often look for in terms of, say, patient outcomes and such. So oftentimes in our search terms, we'll start by the key indication. Like, for example, if I'm looking at psoriasis, I would often start looking at psoriasis, and in my literature review, start looking for patient reported, patient outcomes, anything where, it indicates patient. And then to expand on that, there are some other resources. For example, where I would look is the MAPI Research Trust actually has a really great, I think it's called Proqualid, Proqolid, where they can actually help with some of the searches for existing tools. Another really great research source is to be honest with you, to look in, say, clinical trials around some PROs. So going outside of the literature, right, where you would you would look into like Ovid or some of those areas, is to really do a sweep of the literature in terms of just patient outcomes. And so in terms of what's kind of looking at that, you could look at like symptoms, function. I'm happy to provide a pretty static search term list if you want to disseminate it, that we often use. And then to address your other question on looking to see whether patients were involved, kind of chipping away and exhausting everything, right? And looking and saying, okay, well, I've already scanned the literature, I've done all of this work, I've looked at Proqualid, and were patients involved, yes or no? And then contacting the most obvious answer is contacting the developers of tools that you found. That's oftentimes which we're not seeing that what where we haven't seen patient involvement, when we contact the developer, it may not have made it into the public domain, but they may have existing information on whether or not patients were involved in the development process.
Thanks, Stacie. We also know about, I just saw a couple weeks ago that an updated version of FDA's compendium was also released. And one of the um, useful pieces about the updated compendium is that it lists also the clinical trials that, or the development plans that it was used in. So that could be probably a good starting point too, because one challenge we run into all the time as patient groups is are the pay firewalls for medical journals, which is always so frustrating. But we've had a couple other questions come in.
Well, so just really quickly on the new compendium is a really nice nice document as a starter document as well. I think, it's obviously very regulatory focused, but to expand past that, some of the other areas that we've also looked beyond the compendium is also the drug development tool qualification program that the FDA has ongoing around some of the, qualifying a tool for inclusion. So some of the newer tools that are being considered are also there as well. And another place for some areas is also the PRO consortium working groups. Sorry, go ahead now, sorry.
Sorry, I was on mute. I wanted to ask, we had a couple questions come in. One is, do you have any thoughts on select items from item banks?
Yes, I'm actually quite a fan of item banks, and I'll tell you why. I think, and I'm gonna take off my clinical trial regulatory perspective, and also note that this is also my opinion after 20 plus years of research, is that item banks, I think, are really nice because what I just said is that it could be fit for some but not fit for all. And I'll come back to physical function. Physical function in newly diagnosed cancer patients, right, versus metastatic patients is going to vary extensively, right? Where in newly diagnosed patients, we're looking at maintaining maintaining their functional status. Whereas in more metastatic patients, we're looking at, maintaining or prolonging, deterioration to a point where, say, they're bedridden. And so with an item bank, you can actually select items along the severity continuum, that make it quite useful in terms of differentiation along the severity continuum. So I think item banks are incredibly useful when it represents a set of, say, impacts or a concept such as physical function, where the depth and breadth of those items needs to be extensive. Now, in terms of a symptom item bank, many indications have core symptoms. For example, if we look at depression has a set of cardinal symptoms, and we have diagnostic criteria along the severity continuum of depression and very leading items. In that case, I wouldn't necessarily think that you need an extensive item bank. I think you need a core item set that represents the patient and the clinician's perspective, say, of symptoms.
Thanks, Stacie, along those same lines, one of the questions is FDA officials mentioned they're working on developing a core set of COAs to cut down on duplication of efforts in development of PROs/COAs. Do you have any thoughts about their intentions and how it may play out when they make the COAs public?
So I'm going to put on my quantitative hat on this one, because to make decisions around treatment efficacy and safety using patient outcomes, like for example, there's the PRO-CTCAE, which is patient-reported tolerability in terms of cancer-related adverse events. Now, in terms of having a core item set, I think that that's brilliant, right? Because in terms of having core items that you can select from that represent core tolerability items, to have one set of items within a core item set allows you to compare across trials, right? When, for example, let's say in lung cancer, we have, the lung cancer symptom scale, right? And now, for example, there's the new tool in non-small cell that was developed by the PRO consortium working group. Now, if one group uses one tool and the other group uses another tool, you have to review them separately. And so my thoughts on the intention is that the intention is pure, and the intention is just is that to cut down on the duplication of efforts. I think that this is where CDISC standards came from for clinical trials, right? Is that everybody was collecting data differently, and to be able to look across them consistently and comparatively, I completely agree to cut down on duplication efforts. Now, how it might play out when they make the COAs public, for me, it's a wait and see, because I think with some of the GI guidances that came out, right, where we knew that bowel movement frequency and abdominal pain were the core items to measure. So bowel movement frequency, abdominal pain rate, and stool consistency, right? When that came out, that guidance, it was really useful because we knew those were the core items that we need to ask in say IBSD, IBSC, IBS mixed studies. So it's very helpful. So how it might play out, if it plays out into the intent of the strong intent of what the FDA is proposing to do with this, I think it'll be very successful. Where I think there might be pushback, if I put on the developer hat, is I think that the developers of the tools who are working on these should work together. I tend to be one that thinks that people should work together and not compete, but that would be my hope, is that we don't have 10 scales to measure psoriatic symptoms, right, or psoriasis symptoms, that we don't have 10 scales to measure lung cancer symptoms, that we have core item sets that allow us to measure them consistently and get rid of the duplication, sorry.
Thank you, Stacie. We also had a webinar this past summer featuring Donna Messner that was specifically about core outcome sets and is available on our website as well. Nice. One question that came in is, Stacie, could you elaborate on the FDA roadmap, in particular regarding patient caregiver perspective? How would you go about doing some of that kind of work?
Sure. This is the really fun part of our jobs as COA outcomes researchers. Is maybe we could go back to that slide briefly. There we go. There it is. So once you've done a literature review and you've identified tools that are in the field, I think in terms of how do you approach this, I think recruiting patients and caregivers to participate in a study, you need to think about what your intent is with the data, because every exposure you have, every opportunity that you have to speak to somebody who has an illness should be treated with very, very delicately, right? In terms of how do you optimize your time with them. And so from a purely research perspective, you obviously have to develop a protocol, an interview guide, and you really have to get IRB approval. So it definitely has to go through ethics approval before you approach these folks. And so, I mean, from a very technical standpoint, how do we go about it? Obviously, we go through all of the technical hoops, develop a protocol, and really involve subject matter experts on, what is the most that we can ask them, because you generally only have an hour or so with these folks. Um, and then in terms of the research design around how do you get them involved, I think ensuring that you're sampling from the broader population of patients, and there's different ways. If it's the target population because you're looking to develop an endpoint for your clinical trial, or you're developing again for something that you would like it to be fit for all patients with an indication, is that you want to get patients sampled along that severity continuum. And so how we would go about that is, how many subpopulations are we expecting? And are there known differences? For example, if you're going into a GI indication, one of the things we know is that men and women tend to report on some of the GI symptoms very differently. And we know that through some psychometrics. Like, for example, women may be more bothered by bloating. And I showed that in some studies that I'd recently done. But it's ensuring that if there are subpopulations where from the literature or from your interactions with subject matter experts that are going to vary, that you ensure that you have a nice distribution of patients from those different subpopulations. I did some work, obviously, well, I've done a lot of work in multiple sclerosis. And one of the things that we found is also, are you thinking locally? So if you're thinking locally and it's US, or you're thinking globally, say, US and Big 5 EU, one of the things we found was, for example, walking impairment. In that particular patient group, walking impairment varied because most of the US cities that were sampled are flat cities, where a lot of the European locations and some of the UK locations were a bit more hilly. And so walking impairment meant very different things to two different, groups of people. So when I start thinking about the patient caregiver perspective and how we're going to talk to them, I think about, how are we going to get the best information from these patients? And does it need to be a face-to-face interview for very sick patients with metastatic disease? Does it need to be a phone interview or a video interview? Asking them to leave their house and come, to the clinic again is very difficult. I mean, I know that from personal experience. If somebody asked to interview my mom, it would have been on the phone, because getting her in and out of the car would have been difficult. And then the other bit is on the subpopulations, making sure that you're talking to the right people that represent not only the subgroups of patients, but also the areas, so the demographic differences. I hope I'm answering that question as the person asked.
Thank you, Stacie. Another question is, how about multidisciplinary or maybe multifaceted diseases that have relatively no drugs or treatments available? Do you have suggestions for how to begin when there are no PROs available and there's little clinical information?
Oh yeah, I kind of alluded to that in the introduction, or orphan indications. Um, I've worked in that area, and one of the things that we started with oftentimes you'll be working with some of the rare orphan indications. You've got some natural history studies that are ongoing, and how we start with that is oftentimes when there's very little information in the literature, and it's a very rare indication. For example, I'm working in an indication now where I think there's 40 people thus far worldwide, who would be the whole clinical population. And so one of the things that we've done there is to start with in-depth discovery interviews, really talking to them about symptoms and impacts, because one of the things that is quite unique with some of these rare orphan indications is that the symptoms are heterogeneous as well, right? Some patients might present with cognitive symptoms, where some patients are presenting with physical limitations. And so being, again, starting with the patient in mind is, can we get a set of items that applies to all, and then what do we do about the heterogeneous symptom manifestation? How do we think about that, and how do we talk to the patients who have these different manifestations? And so in those particular cases, when there's very little literature, it's quite a bit of interacting with the clinicians or specialists who are working with those patients, but also really spending time talking to the patients and their caregivers.
Thank you, Stacie. And one final question is following up on the question regarding item banks. How can we ensure the items we select that cover the trait along the continuum are also the most content relevant for our patient population?
Oh, I like this question. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, some of the newer qualitative methods. And so, there's two things that we've been doing here, and there's some papers around this, but is once you've kind of identified the item bank, is to go back to patients, right? And take the items that you've selected and go back to patients and then ask them. It's resampling. Myself and a colleague, Jason Lundy, we presented this notion of resampling at one of the PRO consortium meetings. It's once you've talked to a patient and you identify what's important, and you go and you pull items from an item bank, go back to the patient and ask them, did we get this right? As I said, any interaction with a patient, you should be really cognizant of how you're using them, but bringing patients in as active researchers along the goals that are important to them, I think is important. And I think putting in a mechanism in your research design to go back to patients, the original patients that you spoke to, but then introducing new patients who haven't had any exposure, is actually the best way of doing that. And you can do that through what we call cognitive debriefing, which is really just a fancy research term of saying, dear patient, can you look at this? Walk me through this tool. Are the instructions clear? Do the items cover the depth and breadth of what you're thinking about? And when you sample enough of the patients, you really can get some good information on whether the items you selected from the item bank actually cover the depth and breadth, only the content, but then from the most mild to the most severe patients. And I will say, in a tool that I co-developed in MS, we actually did just that. And when we talked to patients, we went back and re-added an item that had been deleted after the initial cognitive testing. And we said, well, look, even though this fell out, it was one of the most important items to the most severe patients. And I think that that's really important. And I did present that at one of the PRO consortium meetings, but I think it's really important that you do go back and say, I've selected this set of items, and now, dear patients, did I get it right? I don't think the assumption should ever be that we got it right just from selecting it. I think patients have to be involved from start to finish.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacie. Well, with that, we'll close out the webinar. If you go to the next slide, please, we have our announcement for our next webinar, which will be on November the 8th at 1 p.m. And it will be about clinical outcome assessments and 21st century cures, the requirement on patient experience data and related information. And it'll be featuring Meghana Kalasani from the FDA and Annie Kennedy from PPMD. So we're very much looking forward to that. And we'd also like to thank Stacie so much for her time today. And this was a great webinar. We all learned a lot, and it'll be a copy will be recorded and available on our website within the next couple of days or so. So thank you again, Stacie. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited. Have a great day, everyone.